We are quickly moving towards the end of our series on the book of James, a series called Bruh. And you guys have been unbelievable in just the comments and the feedback that you guys have shared with me. So I want to thank you to that. Say thank you to that. And thank you for just engaging with us every week. And I just personally, as a pastor, want to thank you for your personal encouragement that you've offered to me. And so, but I don't know about you. There are a lot of expressions, a lot of idioms we have that use the word money, right? A lot of expressions we have. Expressions like make your money work for you, or money is power, or money doesn't grow on trees, heard that one growing up, or from one of my favorite movies, show me the money, right? Not quite a Bible verse, money is the root of all evil. Money corrupts, time is money. I'm rolling in money. Don't just throw money at the problem. Money makes the world go round. Put your money where your mouth is. Money is no object. Money doesn't make the man, and money talks. Those are just a few that I came up with, and we're going to actually talk about money right now. But before we do that, it's kind of fascinating. So there's a TikTok trend that is happening right. There's somebody giggling because they know this already because it's taken over the internet, and here I'll explain it, and then I'll show it to you via video. But the deal is this: two people get together, two evil people, and they ambush a third person. So these two people will bring a third person in front of the camera and say, we're going to make a TikTok video here. And so they'll explain it. They'll say, I'm going to yell, give me my money. And then we're all going to cheer and clap, right? And then the second person will say, give me my money. And we'll all cheer and clap together. And then they'll explain to the person they ambushed, the sucker, that you're then going to scream, give me my money, and scream, and we're all going to scream and cheer, and that'll be the video, right? Except they don't join in on the third. I mean, you just stand there feeling foolish. And so I think we have a couple examples of that for you guys. And then after that, there we go. Oh, we got the volume.
Just give me my money. Just give me my money. Yay! Just give me my money. No, yay.
It's so lame. So Dryden and Soleil. Oh, here's another example. There we go. It's so lame, and this is what our students do. So Dryden and Soleil decided to ambush me. Is this it? Oh, nope.
Just give me my money.
Just give me my money. Just give me my money. Give me my money. Give me my money.
So lame. Give me my money. Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about money. Why? Because if James didn't hold back on the topic, then I feel like neither should we, right? But will you stop for a moment and just pray with us? Father in heaven, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. If you have your Bibles, James chapter 5, we're going to start reading at verse 1. James says, listen now, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that's coming upon you. Your wealth has rotted, and the moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like a fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields and are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of our Lord Almighty. You've lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You've fattened yourselves in the days of slaughter. You've condemned and murdered innocent men who were not opposing you. May God bless the reading of his word. I don't know about you, but at first glance, Jesus appears to be ripping pretty hard on rich people, or James rather, on rich people. And as someone who grew up poor, like we didn't have a lot of money, we lived well below the poverty line, I remember watching wealthy people that we knew eat at fancy restaurants and go on these elaborate vacations and wear amazing name brand clothing. And as a kid growing up with not a lot of money, that was the thing that kind of stuck with me, that I always remember feeling, not being able to have the name brand clothing because, well, we couldn't afford it. And so what it worked out to be in our family is that we would actually wear something called hand-me-downs, right? You know what hand-me-downs are? They're like leftovers that you wear. I mean, it's terrible. And so we had 5 kids in the family, and when the kid above you would grow out of their clothes, they would then be handed down to you, which was fine in some families. The only sibling I had that was older than me was a sister, so that was not so great. But I remember when it was in the 80s, and I was in middle school, and like the end of the Reebok pumps. Anybody remember put your hands up, the Reebok pumps came out, yeah. And all my friends were buying the Reebok pumps, and the idea was this. There was a tongue on the end of the shoe that had a pump on it, and you would push the pump and squeeze it, and air would inflate in the bottom of your shoe and propel you to jump higher, right? And so everyone was buying Reebok pumps, and I begged my parents, please, 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 can we get me some Reebok pumps? I want to jump high. I want to be like my friends. I want to look cool. We just didn't have the money for it, and so my parents said, no, we can't afford it, but my old shoes had holes in them, and so we had to buy shoes. So we went to the department store. Now, there was a department store on the island where I grew up. It was kind of a bottom shelf department store, right? So, you know, like in this area, you have like Target, right? It's like the upscale department store. And then like Walmart is the department store of the people, right? And then you have Kmart where you're like, if I have to. Well, growing up, we had one called Zellers. It was like below, but that's where we bought all our stuff because it was dirt cheap. And so my parents took me to Zellers, and we're going to buy you some shoes. And so we walk in, and we're going down the shoe aisle, and then my parents find something on the shelf. They're like, look, they're called Z-pumps. Can we buy you Z-pumps? And, well, it literally was the only shoe they had, so they bought me Z-pumps. I remember getting home and putting on the Z-pumps, and I squeezed the pump on the tongue, and the inflation area just exploded, and that was it. So lame, but I remember, like, just wanting so bad to have nice stuff that all the wealthy people did. And so I got to be honest, there's a side of me, I'll call it a sinful side of me, that when I read that text, I want to hear that. I want to hear Jesus kind of getting at those rich people. Go get them, James. Show what's in store for them. And we've got to understand something about every time that we sit down and read this book. And I can't possibly overstate the significance of this, that every time you and I read this book, we bring a personal bias to the text as we read it. Our life experiences, the things done to us and by us, a lot of times affect how we see, read, and interpret the verses and stories. And if we're not careful because of that, we can let those biases, as innocent as they may be, affect what we believe and affect how we teach this book. Does this make sense? This is not James shamelessly ripping on rich people. It's not the case at all. God never condemns people, actually, for having money. He doesn't. And there's people he blesses with money because they're responsible and generous with money, and they resource his mission with the money they give, and they help the poor. So he's not bashing rich people. It's not that case at all. In fact, there is a very specific context for this text. When James says, listen here, you rich people, he's not saying, listen here, all rich people, okay? When James says, listen here, you rich people, he's not saying, listen here, all rich people. This is not a small detail in the text. James is addressing a very specific group of rich people. Now, it doesn't mean that all rich people, and keep in mind, if you live in a house and you've got more than 4 bedrooms and there's a car in your driveway and you've got a TV and a computer and you're in the top 5 wealthiest percent of people in the world. So let's keep that in mind. It doesn't mean that all rich people, since we're not the you rich people, get to just kind of ignore this text and move on to the next section. No, we need to learn and listen so we don't fall into the same trap that we're about to unpack. So what is then the context for what he's saying? Look at verse 4. It says, look, the wages, you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields. They're crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord. He's talking to wealthy landowners. That's who he's talking to, wealthy farmers. Now, there's a little bit of a cultural gap we have to overcome when we read this, because in our current economy and era that we live in, we don't tend to view farmers as the rich people, right? We don't. We think doctors or lawyers or professional athletes, they're the ones that have like all the money. 2,000 years ago, that wasn't the case. So for example, my father grew up on a farm, right? His parents were farmers. My father was kid number 17 of 18. Yeah, my grandmother was a beast. She was 6'2". Think about it, pregnant, like 20 years of your life. There were no twins in there. And so when the springtime would arrive, they would work the farm all the way through the year. And then when the snow fell in December, my grandfather and all of his brothers would go into the woods, and they would live in the woods for 3 months in Canadian winter as lumberjacks, cutting down trees until the thaw came. All the while, my grandmother was home for 3 months with all of the kids by herself. My grandfather never had a vacation. They never went anywhere. They made just enough money to feed their family and take care of the farm. They didn't get rich because they had a farm. That wasn't the case at all. Well, 2,000 years ago was a little bit different. Farmers were some of the richest people around. And so this text is God warning wealthy landowners, if they don't change their ways and in a hurry, there's an impending judgment because of the charge of murder and extortion and an insensitivity of those working the land, because all the while they're living in luxury and they're hoarding this wealth and they're indulging in all the things they want. And God says, listen, life may seem pretty great now, and you may be enjoying yourself now, but if you don't repent, you're going to regret it in a real way. So think about this, because like I said, my father grew up on a farm. I went throughout the past number of years on 5 different field trips to cows and corn and catlet, right? Now, the place no longer exists, which is terribly sad to me, but this past year I went to a different farm with Salsa on one of her field trips, and I can with confidence tell you that farming now is quite different than it was 50 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 2,000 years ago. Today's farmers use complex machines and expensive equipment. Back then, they didn't have those options. Wealthy landowners that called themselves farmers hired and employed either slaves or very poor or very in debt free people to work the land. And so those farmers were some of the wealthiest people in the Roman Empire. The problem, they were exploiting the poor. And James is Jewish, right? And so you don't have to read very far into the Old Testament to realize God's very sensitive to the plight of the poor, and he will defend them violently if necessary when they're being wronged. When God's people especially are taking advantage of them, few things get God more riled up than that. Marcus Varro is an ancient Roman scholar and writer, writing about farming in his day and age, and this is what he says. He says, all agriculture is carried on by human beings, either slaves, freemen, or both. The only freemen who farmed were either the very poor or those hired to work off debt. In his writings, if you read Varro's writings, when he talks about farmers, you know what he calls them? He calls them equipment, because that's how they were seen and treated and abused and discarded. Did you know that every aspect of these workers' lives were determined and dictated by these wealthy landowners? The time they showed up, when they got to leave, how much they made, what the consequences were for not getting the work on time, even things like who they married and got to be friends with. In their era of cash crops that were seen as the surest way to wealth, there's no way on earth these rich landowners were going to do the work themselves. And you get it, and I get it. Being poor is not fun, right? And those of you in this room, and some of you have spent time living well below the poverty line, you know what it's like. Maybe somebody in this room today is living in poverty right now. You know the case. The world we live in does not favor the poor. If anything, the poorer you are, the harder it is to get the resources to dig yourself out of the situation, the poverty that you're in. I see this all the time with my nonprofit, the Wholehearted Foundation. There's a family I was working with this entire year, actually, because about a year ago, this mom, her daughter was sick, and they had to up and move from Southern Virginia to Children's National Medical Center, where her daughter was in the hospital for 4 or 5 months. And because she moved up there, she had to leave her job behind, which means she wasn't making any money, which means she wasn't able to pay rent, so she lost the place she was staying. She was fine for a while because she got to stay at the Ronald McDonald House in D.C. while they were there. But this girl, after her surgeries, had to go to a rehab center a couple hours from where this mom lived, and they didn't have any money, and they were struggling, and we had resourced them a little bit. But when she reached out to me, they're like, we're staying at an extended stay hotel. We can't afford this. Is there any way? And so our foundation paid a number of weeks for this extended stay hotel. And so that was fine. But then when they released her to go back home, they had no home. And now they're continually trying to dig out of the poverty hole that they're in. And if you think being poor in this culture is difficult, try being a Jew 2,000 years ago living in poverty in the Roman Empire. Because it was the poor, it was the peasants who suffered the most. The very people God commanded in this book, lighten their load, provide for them. They had it the worst, especially when it came to taxation. Poor Jewish people had to first of all pay the temple tax. That was a non-negotiable. They had to do it. And then they had to pay on top of that the Roman tribute. Like you could not, you could not get away without paying the Roman tribute. And Rome would occasionally add new and different taxes that would just pop up because of this initiative. And on top of that, they had to pay Herod's expansion project taxation. And so the Jews were paying up to 40% of their income in taxes. That's why Josephus writes, this bled the country dry. And so when Jewish landowners add to the oppression, and they're making their money off the backs of the poor, James says there's going to be a day of reckoning. There's a movie clip I want to show you right now, and it's a very impactful, spiritually moving, deep movie, and it kind of captures this idea. It's from Despicable Me. So, yeah, here we go.
Grow to see Mr. Perkins?
Yes, please have a seat.
I mean, you saw the pillars, right? I love that scene, but this is a bank. You saw people getting crushed that made their money off the backs of the poor. That's what the wealthy landowners were doing. They're not paying the slaves money that's due them. Instead, they're paying pennies on the dollar, and they're beating them when work's not done. Also, they can live and have the luxuries and lifestyles that feed their fancy appetites. And so, yeah, James says, those people, they have it coming to them. It got even worse. Look at verse 6. You've condemned and murdered innocent men who were not even opposing you. Like, they would work the slaves so hard and give them so little at times and beat them so severely that sometimes these workers were killed. And all they were trying to do is make a little bit of money and pay off debt and put food on their tables. That's the context here. He's not bashing rich people. He's bashing rich people who abuse and neglect the poor. And it's vital we understand that. It's so important. But it's also vital that we who are in the top 5% of the wealthiest people in the world pay attention to the warnings in here so we don't make the same mistakes. Because while most of us are not actively abusing the poor, maybe we, verse 3, spend most of our money on ourselves. Or verse 5, live to live in luxury. Or verse 5, live in self-indulgence, because whether or not we like to admit it, money and possessions and the allure they have carry with them a certain danger. And to ignore that danger is detriment and foolish. Ronald J. Sider said it this way in his best-selling, bone-chilling, If You Ask Me book, which I read it the first time and swore I would never read it again because it wrecked me, called Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger, says this: most Christians in the Northern Hemisphere simply do not believe Jesus' teaching about the deadly danger of possessions. We all know Jesus warned possessions are highly dangerous. So dangerous, in fact, it's extremely difficult for rich people to be a Christian at all. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. But we don't believe Jesus, he writes. Christians in the United States live in the richest society in the history of the world, surrounded by 1 billion hungry neighbors. Yet we insist on having more and more. If Jesus, he writes, was so un-American that he considered riches dangerous, then in order to live this way, we have to find a way to ignore or reinterpret his message. And all God's people said, ouch, that's terrible. So what we have to do is look bravely into the text, right? And we got to see what the warnings are so we don't make the same mistakes. And so here we go. If you're taking notes, 3 dangers of the power and pursuit, the pursuit of wealth. And the first danger is this: we ignore God. That's the first danger. The things we have, the things that we're chasing, the money we want, the wealth, the savings, the investments, the financial securities. If we are not careful, we can be so focused on them, we don't see God at all. I mean, that's the danger, right? We don't see, we miss out, we ignore God. Money and stuff can captivate us that much. If it were not true, do you think God would have more to say about the way we think about money and what we do with our money in that book, addressing that more than he does any other topic in the Bible? So beware. That's the warning. That's the message here. The Archbishop Oscar Romero said, how many there are that would better not call themselves Christians. They have more faith in their money and possessions than in the God who fashioned their money and their possessions. In his book, How Much Is Enough? Hungering for God in an Affluent Culture, author and founder of Bread for the World, Arthur Simon, writes about a couple he knows. Their name's Bryce and Ellen. They're a couple in their mid-30s. They have 2 sons and a daughter. And on Sundays, this family attends church most Sundays. But I just want to share what he writes about this family. He writes, Bryce manages about 20 people in a medium-sized accounting firm. He receives a good salary and is on a path he believes to eventually move him into a circle of company executives. So he goes to work early and often stays late and has to work sometimes on the weekends. His wife, Ellen, has a part-time job with a public relations firm, which allows her, the flexibility to be able to manage her house and the kids. None of this is easy, but it's enabled them to buy a house in a very upscale neighborhood and have a lot of recreational stuff, just a raft of toys for the kids, TVs and gaming systems in every room, multiple motorcycles and a boat, all the stuff that they enjoy. Bryce and Ellen talk a lot about retiring early and moving to a place where they can enjoy their year-round outdoor sports. Even though they're deeply in debt, they're able to make timely payments and take pride in contributing more than most in church dollar amounts to the church, which at 2.5% of their income is probably more than most give. And Simon continues as he writes, they would be astonished, probably offended, if anyone suggested to them they were addicted to money. Yet their plans and dreams and the dreams they're nursing in their kids tell exactly that story. You see, there's nothing wrong with having stuff, but they are so busy pursuing stuff. And the time it takes to pay off that stuff to get it all done is to build a life in which, even though they go to church and put money in the plate, by and large, even though they love Jesus, they don't really have a whole lot of time to pursue God. And so it's easy to get into that life of like ignoring God. Jesus said it this way. He said, no one can serve two masters. Either you're going to hate one and love the other, or you're going to be devoted to one and despise the other. He says, you can't serve both God and money. He says, you got to make a choice. That's the danger. He says it's money and stuff, or it's me. You can't pursue both at the same time. Pursuing money, he says, is ignoring me. That's the first danger. The pursuit of wealth. If we're not careful, if God doesn't have ownership of our bank account, the pursuit of stuff and wealth can lead us to ignore the God we love and live for. The second danger in the power of pursuit of wealth is simply this. Not only do we ignore God, we can ignore people. When Jesus was asked, what's the greatest command, right? What did he answer? He said, love God, right? That's the greatest command. And then he offered voluntarily the second greatest command is to love others. And so if the first danger in the power and pursuit of wealth is ignoring God, it naturally, logically follows the second danger is ignoring the people he commanded us to love, because that takes time, and that takes energy, and sometimes that takes resources. That's the danger. And so many of us, because of the lifestyles we built, have jam-filled our schedules and our lives so filled with things that require all of our time and money and energy and resources, we don't have time to spend it on others. Why? We're busy spending it on ourselves. The love and pursuit of money, no matter how much you say you love people, will kill your ability to actually love them. Because love is an action, and love takes time. Love the story. One day, a certain old, crusty, rich man with a miserable disposition visited a rabbi who took the rich man by the hand and led him to a window. Look out there, he said, and the rich man looked out into the street. And what do you see? Asked the rabbi. Well, I see men and women and children, answered the rich man. Again, the rabbi took him by the hand and this time led him to a mirror. Now what do you see? Asked the rabbi. The rich man replied, well, now I see myself. And then the rabbi said, consider this. In the window, there is a glass. In the mirror, there is a glass. But the difference is the glass in the mirror is covered with a little bit of silver. And as soon as the silver's added, you can no longer see others. All you can see is yourself. That's what silver can do. That's the danger. So the question for you is this. Do you spend more of your life looking through a window or looking into a mirror? Do you spend your time and energy and resources primarily on yourself and the life you've built, so much so that you've lost your ability to love and see others? You know, one of the things that I've kind of observed as I've gotten older as a Christian is this, that there's a difference between pity and compassion. There's a big difference. We're great. We're real good at pity. We got pity down. Like pity is when you're watching maybe a show on TV and all of a sudden there's an organization, the commercials hit, and it's maybe like UNICEF or something, and they're showing pictures with sad music in the background of these kids with swelled bellies in a third world country, and we're seeing these pictures and maybe even tears well up in our eyes, and we feel horrible, and how could that be going on? And then what happens? One of two things usually. Either we turn the channel so we don't have to look at it any longer, or we just wait for the commercial to run its course, and we feel bad for a minute until our show is back on. We feel bad when we see homeless people. We feel bad when we hear about families that have lost things. That's called pity. We're really good at pity. What we're called to have is compassion. Compassion is when you soak in the pain long enough that God moves you to do something about it. That's compassion. And what I've observed is this: those too busy with their own lives and their own pursuits and their own stuff When they're confronted with the pain of people in the world all around them, feel pity. But those whose pursuit is God first, others second, themselves third, generally those people are overwhelmingly compassionate. But that's the second danger. The first danger, right, is that we ignore God if we're not careful, if our trust, our faith, and the things we have. And the second danger is of the pursuit of wealth, and the danger of it is that we ignore the people He created. The third and final danger is this. It's simply judgment. James makes it abundantly clear in the text, if your pursuit is anything else but God and following His Son, you will be judged according to that. Let's look back into the text for a minute. He says, weep and wail because of the misery coming your way. That's judgment. The corrosion of your wealth will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. Gross. That's judgment. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. Slaughter. That's judgment. And I get it. So the warning of judgment is specifically for these rich oppressors. We already talked about that. But maybe you're honest enough this morning to admit that you do have a little bit of a love affair with money. That maybe your stuff does mean a little bit more to you than it should. But you're not oppressing anyone. You're not robbing people. You're not doing that. You're not sucking the poor dry. You're just trying to take care of yourself. And how can you say that the same judgment might very well apply to me? That's a great question. Here's why. Because James said there are two kinds of sin. We talked about this last week. There are sins of commission. There are sins of omission. A sin of commission is you actively, knowingly do something wrong. It's the wrong thing to do. You do it anyways. That's a sin of commission. A sin of omission is anyone who knows the good they ought to do and they don't do it sins. If the pursuit of money and the enjoyment of stuff and self-advancement is so important to you that God is here and all that other stuff is way up here, that's a sin of commission. Right? You're pursuing the wrong things like adultery. That's a sin of commission. But that sin of commission, here's the danger, also leads to the sin of omission because you can't do the good He wants you to do if who you're living for is you. Do not, Jesus said, store up for yourselves treasures here on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but store for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where, here it is, here's the $1 million, we're talking about money, the $1 million bottom line. Get your heart and mind wrapped around this truth. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That's the danger, according to Jesus. If your heart is with the stuff, listen, it can't truly be with God. And if your heart is not for God, Scripture's clear, you are then against God. And if you are against God, yes, you get the same judgment James describes. And Jesus is clear on this. And if that's the case, what you need is probably a transformed heart. Do you know what receiving a new heart is? In Christ Jesus, it's called salvation. And that's the question before you today. Are you sitting here going through the motions? That's a cool song, Steve, a nice new song. And hey, look at all these people. I got money when I came in. That was cool. Or are you in a pursuit, love relationship with Jesus? I'm going to have the band come up. So I guess the question is, where does your loyalty lie? Where do you put your faith and trust? I gave every single one of you that I could slow down enough to give it to. And some of you had some really smart alecky comments. A lot of you greedy people tried to come in through the door twice this morning. May God deal mercifully with you. I want you to pull out the dollar that you received when you walked in. You're all like, oh, tricky pastor. He's a real tricky pastor. Yes, I am. On that dollar is written an expression. Can I have someone in here who's loud, annoying, big, bold, to just stand up and read the expression that's written over the word one on the back of the dollar bill that you now are holding in your hand? I knew it was going to be you.
In God we trust.
Thank you, Sammy. In God we trust. That's right. And so why? Why in 1965 did Dwight D. Eisenhower pass a bill making that, in God we trust, the motto of this country? And why would he demand that of all places, that slogan, that expression, that motto appear on the money we hold in our hands? Here is why. Because maybe, just maybe, he was aware that if that was not the case, we would put our trust in what we are holding instead of who is holding us. It's one of the other people. We're going to worship our way out of here in a moment. And I just want to challenge you. You got a couple options you can do with this. You can walk out of here when you're gone and you can keep the money and run. You can pass this bill to someone that you know in life that needs to hear that truth and say, hey, you ever notice this in money? And I just wanted to point that out. In God we trust. And I'm praying that you will put your trust in Jesus. You can give that dollar away. If you're having trouble trusting Jesus, you put that on your mirror. You tape that to a steering wheel of your car. You're the one who needs that reminder. That's what you want to do. You could always put it in the offering box at the back when you leave as well. In God we trust.